Hey, hey, yeah. Thomas, you definitely cannot sit there.
Thomas would have to sit there.
You sat right in the thing where I usually put.
Maybe you should only use one laptop. Wait, do you actually do anything on this?
I use this laptop for recording.
But like you don't need to see it.
I do
If it
because
ghosts you.
if it tries to like kill the call, I need to know whenever it comes up with the thing so I can hit the button. So I like having that there, and I like having it down here, not trying to have them on the same thing. Because then I end up missing whenever it does that, and then the whole thing is shot. So welcome, Thomas. We're on chapter 6. Hope everybody had a good Christmas and I almost said Thanksgiving. Christmas and New Year's. Man, this is why I can never be a teacher.
That's why.
Yeah. So we're doing chapter 6 today of Mark. This is a really, really long chapter. So we're definitely not we're definitely not going to do the whole thing. And actually, as I was kind of going through the latter half of the chapter, I really want to spend more time on it. So today may feel a little bit rushed because I haven't worked that much on this over the break, but the second half, which we'll cover next week, I think there's a lot more going on there than I ever kind of fully realized. So that'll be fun for next week.
We get a brief 30-second brush up on what happened.
So chapter 5. So
it was the women's stories.
Well, chapter 5 is the Gerasene demoniac, right? So you have the Legion story and the casting out of the demons into the pigs, and then the second half of chapter 5 is the coupled story of the two different women, one being Jairus' daughter, the other being the woman with the issue of blood. And we talked about how that's kind of like the ultimate story of like defeat of and casting out of demons, followed by like kind of the ultimate like story of healing. And we've been talking about like that threefold pattern of like begins with preaching, which is Jesus's like highest calling or mission statement, the thing that he thinks is the most valuable, followed up then by casting out of demons, and then lastly healing the sick. And we're actually going to end up seeing that threefold pattern shows up later in this chapter too. But we're coming out of that, and we have this interaction with Jesus at Nazareth. So I'll just play it.
Chapter 6. He went away from there and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. And on the Sabbath he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astonished, saying, "Where did this man get these things? What is the wisdom given to him? How are such mighty works done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, and Joseph, and Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. And Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor, except in his hometown, and among his relatives, and in his own household." And he could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he marveled because of their unbelief. And he went about among the villages teaching.
Okay. So a couple of things note here. So one, this isn't the first interaction in Mark with his parents, right? We had this a couple chapters ago, but it wasn't in Nazareth. Like his family kind of showed up and they were like, "What are you doing?" Right? And there's definitely this this tension between Jesus and his family that's going on there, and we're seeing that again now, not necessarily with his family, but with everybody else from the
Little towns.
from the surrounding town. Also, one of the things that I want to point out, the text itself doesn't actually say Nazareth, right? It says he went away from there and came to his hometown, right? So if you have like a heading or whatever that says like Jesus was rejected at Nazareth, that's something that like later people like came in and put in. Doesn't mean that he's not from Nazareth. Like we have other stuff that like says it, but here very specifically. But this gets to this idea, right? And this like common controversy that people will see of well, everybody talks about like Nazareth being a small town. One of the reasons why like kind of we know that is because at the time Nazareth wasn't even like it wouldn't even be worth like talking about, right? It was just some random little podunk village. And so because of that, most maps wouldn't have even had it written down. And which is also probably why in Mark, which most people agree are like one of the earliest gospels, probably wouldn't say Nazareth because nobody knows what the heck that is. So he says instead he went to his hometown, right? That conveys the information that he wants. It's going to be later people as the movements like picked up a little bit that people know what it is and they'll actually call it Nazareth. This gets to the idea that like in Mike Winger's video that he talks about a little bit, which is there are some like atheists that try to claim that like Nazareth wasn't a town, and they're just like, oh, they made it up, and like it wasn't a town, it didn't exist. It's like it's just a stupid idea. Like it's like there are plenty of places that exist that nobody writes on a map because like 4 people live there. Like why would they go through the effort of inventing a town? Like I think right from an atheist standpoint, they're inventing a religion. That's enough. They don't need to also invent a town. That's stupid. Like so there's lots of little ideas out there that people have that are just silly. What's he doing? He's in the synagogue on the Sabbath teaching. We've talked about how that's like a thing that just happened at the time. People were allowed to come in and say things. But then I want to get to this point of what are they asking? Where did this man get these things? What is the wisdom given to him? How are such mighty works done by his hands? Right. This couples right with that through line that I talked about. That's the through line throughout Mark, which is who is Jesus, and we're actually going to see that through line discussed and talked about multiple times in this chapter. I want to hit on a little bit of, and some of these are points that I've made before, but I'm just going to say them again. Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary? So a couple things. The son of Mary line. Like a solid 95% chance that that's supposed to be an insult. I mean, maybe that's I made up that 95% number, right? So this is my opinion. I think that's definitely supposed to be an insult. Mike Winger in his video tries and say that, oh, maybe it's not. And so like the two options are either, well, maybe they're calling, well, either it's an insult, right? And why would it be an insult? Because you're supposed to say son of, and then the father's name, right? And so by saying son of Mary, you're essentially calling Jesus a bastard and saying that he doesn't have a legitimate father, right? And they're like, and Mike Winger's idea was that, oh, well, maybe they're just calling him son of Mary because Joseph is dead. That's fine. I think that Joseph probably is dead at this point. I think all the evidence from all the gospels suggests that by the time that Jesus is really doing his ministry, Joseph is dead and has probably been dead for a while. That doesn't mean you start calling him son of Mary. Like nobody does that. Like the practice still works even if your dad is dead. Like you can read this throughout the rest of the Old Testament and anywhere else. Whenever they say son of whatever, that doesn't mean that their dad is still alive. Like that's not what that means. It's a way of identification, of identifying of who they're from, status, and all of this. And so yeah, this is definitely meant as an insult, especially within the context of everything that they're saying there. They're questioning whether or not what Jesus is saying is legitimate and how is he doing this and all of that stuff, right?
So, but then are you saying 'cause it never says like, Mary told all the townsfolk growing up like, oh yeah, he's not my real son kind of thing.
well, right.
Just
So
assume
this
somehow figured out.
so this is one of the things that I think is really interesting. It's one of the things that like okay, so there's a couple things going on. It's obvious that people knew that, like, especially in from like what we can see and everything in the text and everything. It's like it's probably obvious that people knew that there was something up with Jesus' birth, right? Like, and it's one of the things where it's like I sometimes think that like if nothing had happened, or like let's pretend that nobody knew that the virgin birth occurred, right? Like let's say that the virgin birth had occurred after they had like gotten married or something like that, and so like it didn't make anybody suspicious or whatever. It probably never would have been written in the Gospels, right? Like it seems to me like it was written in the Gospels because there legitimately was something there with Jesus' birth that other people knew about. And so people had this idea of like, okay, there's something going on there with Jesus' birth where it didn't, like, it was very clear that like Joseph wasn't the birth father.
Mhm. I guess I didn't really use all of my thinking because like, oh, we got back from doing our census. Also, here's my son. Our wedding's next week.
Yeah, right.
Like
Like
we're,
all of that
Yeah.
stuff, right? And so it's
assuming that like in that time the people who were in Nazareth when they came back were still there, 30 years later when Jesus is here.
exactly
Which is probably how it was in most small societies.
because that's how it was everywhere.
That's how it is now in small towns now.
Yeah,
It's like,
people don't move, right?
he was born.
They have their farm, they have their land. I mean, especially in Israel at that time, they have ancestral land, right? That they've had for like generations. It's like they stayed there, really probably, I mean,
yeah, so that makes more sense.
right? And so like there's a reason for that. Also, I do think that it's really interesting that Mark is one of the gospels that we like. There's only two gospels that we don't get a birth narrative in, and it's Mark and John, right? Which I think is interesting because most people consider Mark the earliest and they consider John the latest. And I was thinking about that. I was like, well, why isn't there a birth narrative?
Maybe John didn't think he was actually born.
He just came. Yeah.
He's there.
Well, I think it's pretty obvious for Mark's standpoint why there isn't a birth narrative. And that would be if he included a birth narrative, I think that like probably even, I don't know, maybe I'm doing circular reasoning here because I think there's also a bunch of stuff where Mark very clearly lays out that he thinks Jesus is God. But if he does do the birth narrative like the other ones, I think maybe that takes even more of the mystery out of it. And actually, I was thinking about it. It's a little bit like, right? So, like, because like with this story with Mark, right? We show up in media res, right? So we're in the middle of the story and we're getting all of this stuff, and then we kind of learn a lot about it later. And it's actually even really similar to I saw over the weekend that they're remaking an anime. It's called Trigun. If you don't know what it is, Trigun came out in like the early 2000s or whatever, and it's really good. But it's about like this like guy. It's like a western. Like the whole planet is a desert or whatever. So everything is like western, like all this stuff, blah 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 blah. But the first one is like the I have no idea what you said.
I said skip this ad.
Skip this ad. I'm making a
I'm
point.
sure it gets to it.
I'm making a point. The
Anime
point
just
is
taking its way.
that in the old one is super long, and it takes a really long time because the whole time, the through line through the beginning of that show is who is this guy? Because he shows up places, he has like really good aim, can like shoot things. You learn out later that he's like super smart and he can fix stuff, but he's also like wild and goofy and all this stuff. And so the whole thing is like, who is this guy? Who is this guy? And it's not until like the end of it that you get to see his flashbacks and you learn that actually he's like a weird, like kind of like immortal alien thing from this other planet and like does all this stuff. And like they like created the planet and blah, blah, blah. And he's in like this like eternal battle, all this junk, right? Well, they remade it. And the very first scene in this one is the flashback scene that you don't get until like episode 30 in the other one. And it's of him on the spaceship, like doing all of this stuff. And then like they go down to the planet and everything. And it's like, oh, okay. These are both the same story, but one of them is laying out for you right at the beginning. This dude is super significant and like important, and pay attention as he goes on his journey to fight like the bad guy. Whereas this other one is like, this is a guy that's kind of mysterious and following him around, but we don't really know who he is, and it's going to take us some time to like kind of learn about him. And it's just two different, like it's the same story, but it's just two different ways of like viewing the story. That's the point I was trying to make. Okay. All right. Okay. We're gonna. So we hit the Son of Mary thing. Joseph is probably dead. Perpetual virginity of Mary. These seem like they're the names of Jesus's brothers and sisters, right? So he's got sisters. He's got brothers, right? James. So this one says Joseph. Some say Joseph, Judas, and Simon, right? So
Joseph is a pretty underused name. That
Yeah.
needs to come up.
Well, in other versions I've seen, I think people have it translated as Joseph. So I don't know what's going on there.
I'm just saying J name Moses is a good way to
J
go.
Moses.
J Moses.
Joseph.
Yeah. So if you guys don't know, right? So like the Catholic teaching on this is that Mary was always a virgin, right? That she so she never had any other kids.
She simply popped out 30 Messiahs. I mean, not 30.
No, their claim,
13.
right? So their claim is that, so there's two different competing claims that you'll hear. One is that these are half brothers that of Jesus, that these, and I guess half sisters, that all of these siblings, right? So the four brothers and all of the sisters, however many of them there are, were all from a previous marriage that Joseph had. Which is why in Catholicism, they have Joseph being super old when he gets married to Mary. Like Joseph is like 50 or 60 in Catholic thought whenever he gets married to Mary. And they kind of spin it as like a well, and also I say Catholic thought. Both of the things that I'm saying are different people in Catholicism have these thoughts.
Canons.
The technically the one that's in catechism, the one that's like officially sanctioned by the Catholic Church, is the second one. But the first one, that they're like half brothers and sisters, is coupled with this idea that Joseph is really old, and that he kind of got married to her out of like a,
let me help you out.
yeah, like a help you
Let me
out
help you out
sort
of a jam.
of a thing. Like
Aren't they
like
younger siblings though? Like, how would that even?
Well, of course, that's what we know.
so like it makes more sense that they're younger siblings, because like also if they're traveling around to Nazareth, why are like 8 kids not mentioned in that traveling? like yes, they seem like they're younger, but in Catholic thought, if you subscribe to this idea, you have to come with all these weird ideas to say they're like whatever. I don't know. I can't defend it. It's just the thing that people say.
What one did you say that the church actually?
So the one that the church like officially thinks is that that these are not half siblings, that they are cousins. And the reason why is because if you like strain the definition of like the Hebrew word for brother, it can also mean cousin, right? And it just means like familiar
Why doesn't
sense.
it mean that in every other time?
Yeah, congratulations. You spent 2 seconds and you found the flaw in the plan. There are other places where the words for like cousin are used,
Well, what
and they're
about
different.
John the Baptist.
Again, you spent 2 seconds and you found the flaw in the plan. Like this isn't hard. Like and even like in
Because that would make
Luke,
these,
'cause
that would
you-
make these guys like John the Baptist brothers
It-
and sisters.
or something like that,
They're
right?
not
And they're
talking
not.
about it, like at all.
Yeah, and it's every single time these people are mentioned, they're always mentioned with his mother. So why are his cousins always hanging out with his mother
Their mom died.
And dad.
and dad
And
and
uncle.
and somehow Mary got in charge of
And
everything?
soon their other cousin.
Like it's all just such a hot mess. If you like, it's just a bunch of weird ad hoc stuff that you have to add
Jesus' kids.
so that you can say that
Anything
Mary
to
was
say-
perpetually a virgin, which is a doctrine that you don't even need, right? And so it's just it's a great example of just heaping things on top of each other and coming up with convoluted reasons and rationales for things that you don't need. It's not necessary, but it's the baggage of tradition. Like that's what it is. Okay. So then the actual like point of this whole thing, which is a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown, and among his relatives and in his own household.
It's like the inverse hero story.
Yeah. To me, it's also one of the things, right? So there's a number of things in the Gospels that for me really help cement it in reality, right? That make me go, okay, this is like a real story. And this is one of those aspects. The fact that it's very blatant, in fact, that he has conflict with his family and with the people that he grew up with, and that they are like questioning his status and authority. It's like, yeah, that makes sense because
What's the word he uses? He marvels at it or something?
Yeah.
Oh well, yeah, and he marveled at their unbelief, which, and I was going to point that out, is that
Sorry, I thought it was the same.
that line is, or that observation is often coupled with the other place in the Gospels where Jesus marvels at somebody's faith, and that is with the centurion, which that story is not in Mark. So you have to go to the other Gospels to see it, but it's like really the only other place. But it makes sense as to why you have that, because then you have this inside outside dynamic, and that actually is kind of there throughout the Old Testament, which is displaying the people that should be like the closest to God, that should know what they're like. I mean, just go read the story of Jonah. That's exactly what the story of Jonah is about. Is that like the people of Israel, the prophet is like not acting right, but it's like the foreigner that is acting properly. It's the Good Samaritan story. It's the exact same dynamic, right? All the priests and the Levites and everybody that's supposed to be acting right don't. It's a foreigner, a Samaritan, a person from the outside that comes in and does something right. So you have that same kind of dynamic and tension there, and it's coupled with unbelief on the one side and belief on the other. And it's we know it through church history and other things, but that's going to be one of the things that models how, like, okay, the church starts off in Israel, but is going to spread out through the rest of the world, and it's really going, and not going to take hold as much in Israel as it is in the rest of the world. And in the rest of the world, it's really going to flourish. And but even like that idea is related to a lot of other things that we've talked about throughout Genesis, about like seed planting and growing, and then remnant going back in and growing up again, and like that cycle, right? Because and then this is why you even then have Paul, who is like, it starts whenever he talks about Israel, he's like, I don't think that like God is done with Israel, right? And he's like, one day he's going to like bring them back, and it's going to come back through like the church and like all this other stuff. And you have this like cycle, right? And so that's so there's that. I think those were kind of the only things I wanted to mention on that section. Anyone want to say anything? Yeah, go for it, Thomas.
So, can you read the first part again, or like that passage? We just went-
He went away from there to his hometown. Are you talking about what Jesus said, or what you wanted?
the whole thing, or like just read the beginning of that one.
He went away from there and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. And on the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astonished, saying, "Where did this man get these things? What is the wisdom given to him? How are such mighty works done by his hands?"
Wasn't there a part where they said like a prophet?
A prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and among his relatives and in his own household.
Yes. Okay. So, that means like, what does that mean?
Okay, so basically it's saying that someone, so you have to know what a prophet is. A prophet is someone that is supposed to be speaking on behalf of God, right? And usually, especially like Old Testament prophets, they would kind of be like out in like the wilderness and like the wild and stuff, and they would be getting messages from God to bring back to the people, to usually to criticize the people and to try and bring them back to God. They're trying to reestablish that relationship with God. And what Jesus is trying to do is reestablish that relationship between like the Israelite people and God, right? And so he's doing that. But as he's doing that in his hometown, amongst the people that he grew up with, they're criticizing him and basically are just like kind of laughing at him. And the reason why is because they're like, you're not anyone special. You're just a carpenter. You're not like, you didn't go spend time in Jerusalem. You didn't go get a theological like degree. You're not this super smart person. Who do you think you are? Like, that's what they're saying is, who do you think you are? You're a carpenter. You're basically a bastard. Like you don't have a legitimate like father. Like, you're trash. Why should we listen to you? And he's making the point of, everywhere else that I go, because up until this point, he's been going around everywhere else and been preaching and doing the same thing. And everybody's like amazed by it. And they think it's fantastic. And like crowds follow him and all this stuff. But then he comes back to his hometown and he does it, and everybody's criticizing him. And so he's just making an observation about how things work. And part of it is that you should know that too, as you're doing things, as you're growing up, and like maybe you achieve something, maybe you figure something out, but the people that are around you might keep criticizing you because they know every little thing about you. They know all like the dirty secrets of your family and all of this stuff. And so they'll attack you for it. And so part of the message is like, which I didn't want to highlight because that's usually the thing that everybody else highlights. Like, so if you ever heard a message preach on it, they'll talk about it, but maybe you haven't, so forgive me. But like, it's to that point of like, don't let the fact that just because people know you or know your past criticize you, let that keep you from doing what God wants you to do. Like, God will still use you. but you just might not get the recognition from the people that have known you the longest. But like that's okay.
It's kind of like a little biblical cancel culture because they're just
Kind
like,
of, yeah.
oh yeah, we know you're a bastard. So like those other people, like if we were writing articles and like
They
you know,
definitely pulled up some Jesus tweets from like 10
Oh,
years ago.
yeah, like, here's this one of Jesus. Look, you didn't even have a dad. Like,
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
That's kind of what it is.
That's basically what it is. Yeah,
But they just can't cancel because they can't spread the word.
exactly.
Instead, Jesus spreads the word.
So, what I wanted to ask about was the next verse, just the first line. And he could do no mighty work there.
Yes.
So obviously, with like some of the language on that, could do no mighty work there. Given that we know he's God, is like okay, what is that getting at?
Yeah.
And then does that really reflect on what you were saying about Jesus's priorities? Is mighty work really only at the start of that referring to his preaching? And so the start of his preaching is he got one sentence out, like that's all he got. His preaching about that was that no one's going to listen to me here. And so,
I don't think that one sentence is his preaching.
Right.
He preached earlier,
Right.
and people are like, "Where did he get this wisdom?" So obviously they're responding to preaching he's done previously, right? So like he did preaching. Really, what I think this is great because we've talked a lot about how like the especially for Jesus, a lot of the casting out of the demons and the healing and stuff, those are he's using them as like validation mechanisms for the preaching, right? His primary goal is still the preaching.
Right.
His primary goal clearly here is not to do the work, but the mighty works are for the people, right? And then we've also talked about, right, because there's a big discussion in like faith healing movements and all this stuff about like, oh, make sure you have enough faith to do it. And this is a pretty clear context where it's like, okay, not enough faith in some capacity hindered miracles from occurring. But we've talked about before, like that can't always be the case because like he's healed dead people, right? And like they obviously can't have faith. He's healed people based off of the faith of the friends. And really, to me, what this does go to show is that there is kind of so I actually do have a thing here where I said, when it comes to healing, an enormous amount of like if I'm going to have a bare minimum sentence about what I think this statement teaches us, it's this. When it comes to healing, an enormous amount of communal unbelief might make it so that there are not widespread miracles. So first of all, there are still miracles, right? It says that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. That still occurred, right? So the miracle still occurred. It doesn't
downplay of miracle in the Bible, by the way.
Yeah. Like,
Hey,
the humble brag
It was a
of
Tuesday.
the like. It's like he got like 40
Throwaway
people.
episode, really.
Right? Really filler, yeah. Like,
filler content galore.
but like, and so it's like, okay, so it doesn't like to me. I honestly think about it in the context of almost like you'll sometimes hear people say something like, oh, it feels like more miracles happen like overseas than they do in America, right? I kind of feel like it's the same sort of a vibe as that, right? There's still miracles that happen in America, like, and we still see it and like all this other stuff. But it does seem to be that like, and it's like, it could be for a number of reasons, right? So like one, it straight up could be that just not as many people asked for healing, right? Like if not as many people are going and asking for healing, he can't heal as many people because they're not asking for it.
Or baited him,
right? Oh, right. Did the touching of the garments thing, right? So it's like it could be like it doesn't have to necessarily be like a one-to-one correlation between like they didn't have faith, therefore it could be like they didn't have faith, therefore they didn't do these certain actions that might lead to a healing, and therefore they didn't get a healing, right? And so, but also, and this is actually, I think, a very good point that Mike Winger pointed out, which is that these people are not Christians. right? They're not following Jesus. They're not trying to be Christ-like. So by definition, these people are not Christians. And so being surprised that a bunch of non-Christians are not being healed, like, isn't that crazy? And so I don't think we should then turn around and transplant that idea into our time and space where people are Christians and they're asking to be healed and they're not healed. And so then we go back to this verse and say, it's because you don't have enough faith. It's like, no, you skipped like a bunch of things there to try and make that point. And so that's sort of how I take what's going on in the verse, is that it's like, because of the way that the whole community is acting towards him, therefore not that many miracles are occurring.
Okay. Well, and it's good. I did want to ask because the wording of it is a bit strange, especially because, like, under that interpretation, it's like, okay, and he didn't do as many mighty works because no one asked for it. So that's like a reason and explanation. But like, and he could do no mighty work there, except that he did do some.
He did do something.
Almost. Maybe it's just because there's so many of this concept out there, but like there in a lot of other like fictional worlds where there's like a pantheon of gods, and like they're built up because like they have a belief system. So there's like, okay,
Sure.
their power is based on how much
worship they have.
Even Santa Claus is based on this. How much you believe,
If
clap
you
for Santa,
clap
he
enough,
can
yeah,
do it.
yeah.
So there wasn't people around doing that.
Yeah.
It makes it have that kind of like feel.
Yeah, that vibe. Yeah.
Even though like obviously on the face of it, it's preposterous.
Right.
Applied to God.
Right.
Though with the right amount of like context, it does. It's the same reason of like, okay, why is not everyone on the planet saved? It's like he can't save everyone because not everyone's like asking or to be saved.
Right.
It's just a weird word.
When I think of the wording in Matthew, I can't, maybe it's like chapter 8 or something, but it's like that same. It's like, you know, he was the prophet in his own town, is disrespected, whatever.
Mhm.
And then it says, and he did little miracles because they had little faith, or something like that. The
Mhm.
wording in that is more provoking of the idea of, oh, you know, I gotta go this way. But this wording, at least this is also ESV. I'm maybe quoting, you know, NIV, whatever.
Sure.
But this wording does make it sound like more like what we talked about the last few, well, not weeks, meetings. How it's kind of like Jesus preaching, and then the byproduct is these miracles, you know, that comes along with it. And so when you're not going to let him preach and just shout all this crap at him, you know, after a few minutes of trying to preach, then those byproducts aren't going to fall upon you.
Sure. Yeah.
That makes me think like that more than the Matthew story where it's like, oh, well, you should have had more faith, people.
Yeah.
Which is obviously dangerous. Like you said.
All right. We'll hit the next one.
And he called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2, and gave them authority over the unclean spirits. He charged them to take nothing for their journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, but to wear sandals and not put on 2 tunics. And he said to them, whenever you enter a house, stay there until you depart from there. And if any place will not receive you and they will not listen to you, when you leave, shake off the dust that is on your feet as a testimony against them. So they went out and proclaimed that people should repent. And they cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and healed them.
Okay, so I just wanted to we'll start at the end, because again, you see that what I was talking about, like that threefold pattern. They went out and proclaimed that people should repent. So they preached, they cast out many demons, and then they healed the sick, right? And so what Jesus is doing here is he is right. So this is a big shift in Jesus's ministry, right? He is now he's had this dynamic of mostly just him doing it, right? He's brought along some other guys to help him, but now he's gonna start sending them out 2 by 2, right? This 2 by 2 pattern is gonna get used elsewhere.
Noah?
Not that kind of 2 by 2. But you know what? There's still a correlation there, right? Because right, the point of the 2x2 in Noah is that you are making children, right? And the point of the 2 and 2 here is that you are going out and you are making more Christians, right? That's the idea. Like those ideas like are linked. And this is a pattern that's going to get played out throughout the church. They're going to keep doing this. They're going to do this again whenever the 70 gets sent out, and they're going to keep doing it through all their different missionary journeys. Paul, whenever he goes out, he's going to bring another, right? Barnabas or something, and I forget. And then whenever they split, then he picks up like a different one, and another one picks up a different one, right? And then so they're always going out by twos, right? This has practical benefits, which is that one, it's safer for traveling if you have like somebody with you. Two, like you can check each other on your like doctrine and your history and what you're saying, and make sure that you have like accountability for like what you're teaching and all that stuff. Yeah, you and all that. You can swap off like who's preaching, right? There's like a bunch of benefits, right? If you want to know the benefits of having a second person there, go watch the show Alone, and realize what happens whenever you don't have a second person there. It's awful. One of the things that I want to focus on, though, is this line. He charged them to take nothing for their journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts. This is a line that people talk about a lot, and like you'll see a lot of people kind of discuss this. So like it's pretty obvious that, right, so this idea of no bag, no bread, no money, that they're supposed to be dependent on God, right? Like that's sort of obvious. Everybody gets that. The question is, like, because that command was given to these 12 in this instance, is that a command that's like always supposed to be there for like anyone that ever does any missionary work ever? And should we all be living like lives of aesthetics where like we don't have anything, right? We're just like hermits and going along and constantly asking other people for stuff and not have any money of our own and all this stuff. I would argue no. There are other verses where like later on in different contexts where Jesus like does tell people to take like supplies. Like he's basically telling them to take like no supplies here. Mike Winger in his video, he makes the point that he thinks that the reason why they're not taking supplies here is because it's like a short journey kind of a thing, and that later on, whenever they're taking longer journeys, then they'll take supplies. I don't think that's really what's going on here. To me, what's really going on here, and the thing that I want us to pay attention to, is not what Jesus tells them not to take. It's what Jesus tells them to take. What does he tell them to take? A staff, right? And
sandals.
That way you can turn it into a
Well,
snake and eat the snake.
That's kind of
There
right.
you go.
And
There's your
sandals,
food.
but really it's a staff.
And implied a belt as well.
But yes, they are.
as a belt.
They are still wearing clothes. That's correct. But the clothes are more implied, right?
Except for the stress, don't be too comfy. Don't wear
Exactly, right? Because you're not supposed to be having too much, right? So like, and actually to just kind of even reiterate how wrong some people are. So again,
You should
and during word commentary,
you should name a segment for just
hating on this dude's commentary.
Yeah.
Yeah. So literally, he goes, he commanded them to take nothing for the journey. The disciples didn't need fancy equipment to preach a simple message. Too much stuff would get in the way of their urgent message. This is his point. There was a rule from the Jewish rabbis that you could not enter the temple area with a staff, shoes, or a money bag because you wanted to avoid even the appearance of being engaged in any other business other than the service of the Lord. He told him to take a staff.
Mhm.
How'd you miss that in your commentary, bro?
And shoes.
Like,
That's 2 and 3.
yeah, what are you doing? How is this guy like the top search result for commentaries on Google?
Is it just him that does enduring work?
I think so. I think it's like just him.
Really?
It's like just this
I
guy.
thought they had like multiple guys.
Maybe they have multiple. I don't know.
You just happen to always.
I don't
find the
know.
one guy. What's his name? You know, it's always the same guy.
Oh, we shouldn't out.
I'm not gonna out him.
Wow.
I don't.
I guess if it's not just him, then you would.
2018 David Guzik.
Music?
Guzik. Yeah, not a fan. Anyways, so the staff. Okay, so what's the point? Okay. Very clearly, it seems very clearly to me what's going on here is that Jesus is right. So we've had this whole idea about who is Jesus and all this stuff, and he has this authority very early on. This question of authority. He's the new guy teaching with one with authority. All of this stuff. Well, now what he's doing is he's distributing his authority. So he's doing a distributed authority. Okay, what is the symbol of authority? Staff, right? Go read Moses and go read like anything else. Like the staff is the symbol of authority. So what is Jesus really telling them there? What he's telling them there is that all you need is my authority. That's what you need. You're going to go forth with my authority, and you're going to proclaim and cast out demons and heal. You're going to do all of that stuff with my authority. That's why he's telling them to take staff, right? Those things are linked, and that's the only thing that you really need. That was basically what I wanted to say. That was really all I had for that. But it's just, I think if you like focus too much on the not taking stuff, you'll miss the part where he's like, this is the thing that you actually need. And the reason why that's important is because actually for setting up this next story, because okay, what Jesus just did is he set up a competing hierarchical structure, right? And we talked about at the beginning of Mark, what Jesus is doing is Jesus is showing up on the scene, and Jesus' plan is to take over the world, right? Like that's his plan, and basically lays it out. Well, to do that, he's going to set up a competing system, and it's been this competing system since Genesis, right? And we've talked about that Genesis of the men of the name versus the men who make a name for themselves, right? The men of renown, like the big people that are in charge, right? Versus people that are trying to serve God properly. And Genesis is all about that dynamic, right? And we are now at it, and really the whole of the Old Testament is about that. And now we're at the point where Jesus is going to start to flip that. And the goal is that eventually it really kind of is that the kingdom of God takes over. The kingdom of God is going to like take over everything. And which is why it now cuts to, for a lack of a better term, the reigning like Nephilim, the reigning like big ruler guy at the time, which is King Herod, right? So on to the next section.
King Herod heard of it, for Jesus' name had become known. Some said, John the Baptist has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him.
Okay, this section is super long. We're not going to talk about it that much. But one of the things that I want to highlight and that I want us to think about a lot is that verse, right? Where it said, John the Baptist has been raised from the dead. What did he mean by that? Okay, because this is like the issue that really the early church is dealing with, is like, what does it mean to be raised by the dead? Okay. And you're like, if you do any, like, every atheist opinion about Jesus is like basically along the lines of like, oh, they just took these ideas from like other people and they were just like dumb country bumpkins and didn't like know what they were talking about, and so they just borrowed ideas from other religions and stapled them all together to do. No, they're not stupid. They know that whenever the language of raised from the dead gets used by other religions and stuff, they're not really talking about like a person dies and then comes back. That's like, they're not confused. They don't think that. What they think is that it's something like this, right? Herod doesn't think that, like, and by the time we get to the end of this, Herod doesn't think that John the Baptist is back alive. He thinks that there's like a spiritual way in which John the Baptist is alive, and that like the powers that John the Baptist has, or the spirit that John the Baptist has somehow transferred into like another person and is now like haunting him. That's what Herod thinks is going on, right? And you have this like with other things too, whenever people are like, okay, and it says like, and he is Elijah. Elijah's, well, Elijah is a little bit different because in Jewish thought, pretty sure Elijah is the one that was taken up into heaven, so he wasn't dead. But the idea is that he's gonna like come back. But even then, and you'll see this in other places, we'll get to it eventually, where Jesus talks about it, because Jesus will say like Elijah has come, and he's not talking about like actual Elijah coming, right? But this is important because it helps to show that whenever we get to parts which in the Gospels, that they are legitimately talking about people, or specifically Jesus rising from the dead. This is why they go out of their way to be like, we're not talking about like this other stuff of like, oh, just like somebody that's kind of like him or something like that. They're like, no, we saw him. This is why like the Doubting Thomas story is in there. And he's like, no, like we saw him, like we touched him, and like all this stuff. Like those things were in there because they were trying to differentiate it from these like colloquial folklore kind of understandings of a person being raised from the dead or a person coming back, and just meaning like the spirit or somebody that's kind of like them. That's not what they're talking about whenever it comes to Jesus.
When others said, he is Elijah, and others said, he is a prophet like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. For it was Herod who had sent and seized John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because he had married her. For John had been saying to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. And Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to put him to death. But she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he kept him safe. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he heard him gladly. But an opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for his nobles and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. For when Herodias' daughter came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl, ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it to you. And he vowed to her, whatever you ask me, I will give you, up to half of my kingdom. And she went out and said to her mother, for what should I ask? And she said, the head of John the Baptist. And she came in immediately with haste to the king and asked, saying, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And the king was exceedingly sorry, but because of his oaths and his guests, he did not want to break his word to her. And immediately the king sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. He went and beheaded him in the prison, and brought his head on a platter, and gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard of it, they came and took his body and laid it in a tomb.
Okay, so I know that was a really long section, but I'll quickly try and run through the points that I had. So King Herod is having his "Who is Jesus" moment, right? Like that's like his whole thing. So for Herod, it's somehow connected with John the Baptist. Then we get this story of him killing John the Baptist. Why do I think this is in here? I think this is in here because this is a story that's meant to show the perversion of like the systems of like the people that are in charge of like governments and man-made systems, right? That's the whole point. Right? Shouldn't it be without question that the dancing was some kind of like erotic thing, right? I don't think he was just like, that's some really good ballet you did there. Like, yeah, like you got spunk, kid. You're going places. You're gonna be on Broadway. Like that. Yeah, like that's not what it is. Like it was clearly something like perverse. But it's also interesting for this whole idea of like, why was Herod sorry? Even the fact that he's sorry, I think, helps emphasize the kind of perverse nature of what's going on with like the people that's in charge. Because,
Kind of like with Pilate.
well, I think it's a little bit different, but it's more like he probably thought, right? Because so Herod technically is the king of the Jews at this point in time. Rome is in charge, but Rome doesn't actually have claim over like Judea. Instead, Rome appoints the Herods to be in charge of the region. But they use the Roman forces to like maintain law, collect taxes, yada yada, all that stuff. But technically it's still Herod that's in charge. And Herod is what's known as a Hellenized Jew. He's really like a Greek speaking Jewish person. And so he knows that he's not really following the Torah and the laws and everything correctly. And so he's kind of like one of those people that are like nominal Christians, where they're like, oh, I like I maybe go to church on like Christmas or whatever, or like or I used to, but I went to college and I sinned too much. So now I think if I go, I'm gonna burn up the second I walk through the door or something like that. Herod's kind of like one of those people, right? And so because of that, he sees this like wise guy, John, and he's like, oh, I don't want to like do anything bad to him because I recognize that he's like a holy person, but
The Green Mile.
but he's also calling me out for my sin, which is what John was doing. Like John was like, you're doing a really sinful thing. You should stop doing that because you're supposed to be the king of the Jews. You're supposed to be representing all of us, and you're not. And so it's his wife, Herodotus, that does this whole plan, right? And gets him killed. But then, and so that's why he's sorry. And so so he thinks that, oh, I can just get things, whatever I want, right? I can woo this girl that did all this dancing stuff by flexing my status, right? That's what he does. He goes, I can give you up to half of my kingdom, right? He's flexing. He
No, 50% stake in the company.
Come on, Aaron.
Risk of a hostile takeover there.
why? But so he's literally flexing his status. He
Up to
thinks
what
that
part-
he can
wasn't up to
utilize
the
his
people.
status, his position, and his money to get everything that he wants. The reason why he's sorry is because he ends up getting tricked by the corruption of his own vows, of the own things that he's done, of his own actions, and he ends up having to do something that further cements in his own like psyche that he's a terrible person, right? He thought it was going to cost him money, and said it cost him like a part of his soul, right? He had to go kill this person that he was like, that's a holy person I don't want to mess with. But now he went and killed him because he was flaunting his own excesses, which is why he thinks that whenever Jesus shows up and is doing all of this stuff, he feels guilty about it. And he's like, this is karma coming back to me. And so John the Baptist is back, and he's like, he's going to cause him problems. He's going to do all this stuff. That's what's going on there in like his own head. We're going to end there. But I'm also, I'm going to make this point now because I'll probably remake it next week. I think that there is a very clear connection between a very clear thematic and literary connection between this story that just happened and the next one where Jesus feeds the 5,000, right?
The John the Baptist.
And the John the Baptist story. And to get it very simply, all you have to
You gonna
do.
spoil it right now? Is that what you're
Oh yeah,
saying?
I'm gonna say it. I'm spoiling it right now. He serves John the Baptist's head on a platter. Right? So literally, he is the Cain and Abel story. Sin is crouching at your door and it wants to come and like consume you. Sin is this consuming, like, it's this weird consuming sexual beast, right? We go back and like read the Cain and Abel story to make that point. This is it is in there, and that's what this is. It's
I
this
did miss
like
this for this Cain and Abel.
like this whole thing is like it's a weird this story is about like the systems of man serve up people and it eats them and consumes them and generates more sin. That's what it does. The idea of his head being on the platter is supposed to link the idea of his head with being food, and that should be contrasted with what Jesus is about to do, right? And you also have to get in the idea of where so like just mental picture, this is happening in a palace, right? In a palace, a structure generated by human beings. And what's happening is that a human being is being served for food. Contrasted with a story that's going to take place out in the wilderness where there's nothing and human beings are going to come out, and from God, human beings are going to be fed. It's a mirror story.
Physically and
Yes, it's a mirror story. That's what it is. And we're aware of mirror stories because they happen all the time in the Bible, and they happened all the time through Genesis, where we'd be like, we got this story, and then right after it is a mirror story. So that's what this is. You have this one story, and now you're having a mirror story, and you're seeing the contrasts. Questions, comments, concerns?
At the risk of sounding dumb, is there a payoff to the setup of Herod feels bad about killing John the Baptist? 'Cause I don't remember. Because like, does that influence his actions later on?
Does he come up at all later?
Does it come up at all?
I don't.
Because I'm thinking that
At this point, I haven't done. I haven't. It's been so long since I've read the rest of the book. I don't think so.
because I'm pretty sure that
I
the point
don't
of that
think
story
so.
was to do what you mentioned about being a mirror story, and then also to tell us, hey, what happened to John the Baptist.
Yeah,
But like,
Oh, yeah, this guy, yeah.
but it also definitely set up that notion of like, okay, well, Herod feels guilty,
yes,
but like we don't do anything with that,
yeah.
from what I can tell.
Maybe he repents.
So it just seems like okay, it was a way to transition.
And
into the
I
two
would
stories,
need
but,
to
like,
do, because there are stories about Herod in the future, but I don't
Do we know it's the same one?
I don't know it's the same one. That's my issue at the moment. I'd have to go back and read
And
research.
is there any tell of like influence of like, okay, he feels remorse over previous actions relating to Jesus or anything
No,
like
it's
that?
because he gives this speech and he like gets consumed by worms.
Yeah, see? Yeah,
Yeah.
no, it doesn't really.
Yeah. So at this point, I'm gonna guess no.
Yeah.
But
That was a Chekhov
I don't
gun,
know.
just not really followed through on
Yeah.
by Mark there.
Yeah. But actually, I'm really excited about next week. Just because like I don't know, I read it today and I was like, oh, there are like connections here that I've like never seen before. This is pretty wild. And so we'll hit that next week. So I will go ahead and end the recording.